When Sarah fed 2 freezing boys on a winter night, she never imagined that one act of mercy would expose her to the billionaire CEO she'd spent 3 years running from. The next day, Alexander Crane walked into her diner, sat down in her section, and told the world that the waitress terrified of taking his order was his wife. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The snow fell in thick, relentless curtains outside Miller's diner, turning the world into a blur of white and gray. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed their familiar evening song, casting everything in that particular shade of tired yellow that only 24-hour diners seem to possess. Sarah Chun wiped down the counter for the 3rd time in an hour, her movements mechanical, born from muscle memory rather than any real need for cleanliness. At 7 in the evening on a Wednesday in late January, the dinner rush had come and gone, leaving behind only the usual stragglers, the lonely souls who had nowhere better to be, and the shift workers grabbing a quick bite between jobs. Sarah had been one of those stragglers once, back when her life was different, back when she was different. Now she was the one serving them, and she'd made her peace with that. The diner was her sanctuary, her second chance, her new beginning. The bell above the door chimed, and a gust of frigid air swept through the warmth of the restaurant. Sarah looked up, her professional smile already forming, but it faltered when she saw them. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, stood just inside the doorway, snow melting on their threadbare jackets and sneakers that had seen better days. Their cheeks were red from the cold, their eyes wide and uncertain. They weren't the kind of kids who wandered into diners alone on winter nights. Not in this neighborhood. The older boy, thin with dark hair plastered to his forehead from melted snow, held the younger one's hand tightly. The smaller boy had the same dark hair, the same sharp features, clearly brothers. They stood frozen, not from the cold outside, but from the overwhelming anxiety of not knowing if they belonged in this warm, bright space. Sarah felt something crack inside her chest, a familiar ache she'd learned to keep buried. She knew that look. She'd worn it herself once. That expression of desperate hope mixed with the certainty of rejection. She set down her rag and walked around the counter, keeping her movements slow and non-threatening, the way you might approach a frightened animal. The few other customers in the diner had noticed the boys too. An older man in a booth by the window frowned and turned back to his newspaper. A young couple in the corner booth whispered to each other, their eyes darting between the boys and the door as if expecting someone to come claim them. But nobody ever came for kids like Sarah knew that too. She crouched down to their level, bringing herself to their eye line. The older boy's grip on his brother's hand tightened, his jaw set in a defiant line that was heartbreaking in its premature adulthood. He was trying to be brave, trying to be the man neither of them probably had. The warmth of the diner was already doing its work. The snow on their clothes had turned to water, dripping onto the worn linoleum floor in small puddles. Their pants were soaked through at the knees, and Sarah could see the younger boy shivering, though he was trying hard not to show it. His brother noticed and pulled him closer, wrapping an arm around his shoulders in a protective gesture that made Sarah's throat tighten. These boys were alone, cold, and undoubtedly hungry. The question was why, and while Sarah's instincts screamed at her to find out, to call someone, to get them help, she also knew that sometimes help came in the form of questions and investigations that tore families apart. Sometimes the system that was supposed to protect kids like these only made things worse. She'd been in the system herself once, brief, and the memories were still vivid enough to make her cautious. Sarah made a decision then, the kind of decision that came from the gut rather than the head, the kind that bypassed logic and went straight to the heart. These boys needed food and warmth, and they needed it without judgment or interrogation. The rest could wait. She stood up, gesturing toward an empty booth near the kitchen, away from the windows and the prying eyes of the other customers. The red vinyl seats were cracked but clean, and the table had a small vase with a plastic flower that Sarah had insisted on placing in every booth. A tiny touch of something beautiful in a place that was otherwise purely functional. The boys exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them that only siblings could understand. Then slowly, they moved toward the booth, their wet shoes squeaking on the floor. They slid onto the seats, the older boy on the outside, positioning himself as a barrier between his brother and the rest of the world. Sarah grabbed 2 menus from the counter, but as she approached the table, she realized how pointless they were. These kids weren't here to order. They were here because they had nowhere else to go. She set the menus down anyway, then pulled out her order pad, clicking her pen with a practiced motion. The diner's manager, Tony, was in the back office doing paper, and the cook, Marcus, was visible through the kitchen window. His broad back turned as he cleaned the grill. Neither of them had noticed the boys yet, and Sarah wanted to keep it that way. Tony was a good man, but he was also a practical one. He ran a business, not a charity, and he wouldn't approve of her giving away food to kids who couldn't pay. But what Tony didn't know wouldn't hurt him. And Sarah had gotten very good at knowing what to share and what to keep to herself. That was a skill she'd learned the hard way, back when her life was measured in secrets and survival. The older boy was looking at the menu now, his eyes scanning the items with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing rather than choosing. Sarah noticed his hands, small and chapped from the cold, gripping the laminated edges. The younger boy wasn't looking at the menu at all. He was looking at the counter where a pie sat under a glass dome, its golden crust and dark berry filling visible even from across the room. His eyes were fixed on it with the kind of focus that only true hunger could produce. Sarah had seen that look before too, in mirrors and in the faces of others who knew what it meant to go without. She cleared her throat softly, and both boys jumped, their attention snapping to her with startling synchronicity. The older one's face became a careful mask, neutral and closed, while the younger one simply looked scared. Sarah kept her voice gentle, the same tone she might use if she were talking to herself, conversational and warm. She asked them what they wanted to eat, but the older boy just shook his head, a small, tight movement that was clearly practiced. He said they were just waiting for someone, that they'd warm up and be on their way. It was a lie, and all three of them knew it, but Sarah didn't call him on it. Instead, she nodded as if that made perfect sense, and told them that while they waited, they might as well have something to warm them up. She didn't wait for an answer. She turned and walked back to the counter, grabbing 2 large ceramic mugs and filling them with hot chocolate from the dispenser. She added extra marshmallows, the big ones that Marcus kept in a jar by the register for kids, though they rarely had children in the diner. Then she went to the pie and cut 2 generous slices, the kind that would make Tony wince if he saw them, and plated them carefully. She added a scoop of vanilla ice cream to each plate, watching it begin to melt against the warm berries, creating little rivers of cream and juice. When she brought everything to the table, the boys stared at the food like it was a mirage that might disappear if they blinked. The older boy started to protest, started to say they didn't have money, but Sarah cut him off gently. She told them it was on the house, that the cook had made too much and it would just go to waste. Another lie, but a kind one. She set the mugs and plates down and told them to eat, that whoever they were waiting for wouldn't want them sitting there cold and hungry. The older boy looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for something, perhaps trying to determine if this was a trick, if there would be a price to pay later. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded once. A small, solemn acknowledgement, pulled his plate closer. The younger boy didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his fork and dug in with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't eaten in far too long. Sarah watched them for a moment, feeling that crack in her chest widen into something that was almost painful. Then she turned away, giving them privacy to eat without being observed, to pretend for just a little while that this was normal, that they were normal kids having a normal meal in a normal diner on a normal winter night. She went back to the counter and resumed wiping it down, keeping one eye on the booth, ready to intervene if anyone bothered them. If anyone asked questions she knew they wouldn't want to answer. Outside, the snow continued to fall, heavier now, accumulating on the sidewalks and streets in thick drifts that would make driving treacherous and walking nearly impossible. The city was shutting down for the night, surrendering to winter's assault. Inside the diner, the boys ate their pie and drank their chocolate. For those few minutes, they were safe and warm and fed. Sarah didn't know their story, didn't know where they'd come from or where they'd go when they left. She didn't know that in less than 24 hours, her own carefully constructed life would shatter like ice under a hammer. She didn't know that the past she'd been running from for 3 years was about to walk through that same door and change everything. All she knew was that these boys needed help, and she could give it to them. Sometimes in a world that seemed designed to be cruel, that was enough. Sometimes a slice of pie and a warm place to sit was all the salvation anyone could offer. And sometimes, though Sarah didn't know it yet, a simple act of kindness could set in motion a chain of events that would unravel every lie she'd ever told, including the ones she'd told herself. The boys stayed in that booth for nearly an hour, nursing their hot chocolate long after the pie was gone. Sarah refilled their mugs twice without comment, and brought them each a grilled cheese sandwich that she claimed was a mistake order, though Marcus gave her a questioning look through the kitchen window that she pointedly ignored. The older boy had finally relaxed enough to tell her their names. The older one was Danny, and his little brother was Michael, though everyone called him Mikey. They were 7 and 9, Sarah learned, not 8 and 10 as she'd guessed. Hunger had a way of making children look older than they were, carving premature shadows under their eyes. Danny did most of the talk, his voice quiet but steady. Mikey mostly just nodded and ate, his eyes still tracking every movement in the diner with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and danger could arrive without warning. Sarah didn't push for details, didn't ask where their parents were or why they were out alone in a snowstorm. She'd been on the receiving end of those questions too many times herself, and she knew they never came from genuine concern, only from a desire to categorize, to file away someone else's tragedy into a neat little box that made the questioner feel better about their own circumstances. But she did learn in the careful way that Danny parceled out information that they lived with their grandmother in an apartment 6 blocks away. Their mother was gone, though Danny didn't specify if that meant dead or just absent. And their father was a word Danny used that made Sarah's jaw tight, a word that explained the old bruises she could see now on Mikey's arms when his sleeves rode up. Their grandmother worked nights as a cleaner in an office building downtown, and she usually left them dinner and strict instructions to stay inside and do their homework. But tonight there hadn't been any dinner, and the heat in their apartment had been shut off 3 days ago because the landlord said their grandmother was behind on rent. Danny explained all of this in a matter-of-fact tone that was somehow more heartbreaking than if he'd cried. He said they'd left the apartment because it was actually warmer outside with their coats on than it was inside without any heat. They'd walked until they saw the lights of the diner and figured they could at least warm up for a little while before heading back. He didn't mention being hungry. but the way both boys had devoured every scrap of food Sarah had given them told that story clearly enough. Sarah listened, her hands wrapped around her own coffee mug, feeling the familiar rage building in her chest. The rage at a world that let children freeze and starve while people with more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes hoarded their wealth like dragons guarding treasure. She'd been one of those children once, and she'd promised herself that when she had the means, she'd never turn her back on another kid who needed help. The problem was she didn't have the means. She was a waitress who could barely afford her own rent in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. She couldn't take these boys home with her, couldn't pay their grandmother's bills, couldn't fix the fundamental brokenness of a system that valued profit over people. All she could do was give them food and warmth for a few hours and hope it was enough to get them through one more night. But she could do one more thing, she realized. She excused herself from the table and went to the payphone by the restrooms, fishing quarters from her apron pocket. She dialed a number she'd memorized but never called and waited through 4 rings before a familiar voice answered. Sarah identified herself and explained the situation in quick, quiet sentences. Conscious of Tony in his office and Marcus in the kitchen, both of whom would have questions she didn't want to answer, the voice on the other end listened without interrupting, then told her to keep the boys there, that someone would come. Sarah hung up and returned to the booth, sliding into the seat across from Danny and Mikey. She told them she'd made a call, that someone from a community organization was coming to help, someone who could talk to their grandmother about emergency heating assistance and food program. Danny's face closed off immediately, suspicion replacing the tentative trust that had been building. He asked if she'd called the police, if they were going to take them away from their grandmother. The panic in his voice was sharp and real, and Mikey started to cry, tears rolling down his cheeks as he grabbed his brother's arm. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over Danny's, feeling how small and cold it still was despite the warmth of the diner. She promised him, looking directly into his eyes so he could see she meant it, that she hadn't called the police or child services. She explained that the person coming was someone she trusted, someone who helped families stay together, not tear them apart. She told them about her own childhood, just enough to let them know she understood that she'd been where they were. She said she'd never do to them what had been done to her, that the whole point was to help their grandmother, not punish her for being poor and working herself to exhaustion trying to take care of them. The truth in her voice must have reached them because Danny slowly nodded and Mikey's tears slowed to sniffles. They waited together, the 3 of them in that cracked vinyl booth, while the snow continued its relentless assault on the city outside. Sarah bought them time by bringing more hot chocolate, by asking about school and learning that Danny loved math and Mikey was good at drawing. She asked if they'd done their homework, and Danny admitted they hadn't because it was too dark in the apartment without electricity and their grandmother couldn't afford batteries for the flashlight. The casual mention of these deprivations, delivered in a child's voice as simple facts of life, made Sarah want to scream, but she kept her face calm, kept her voice steady, and promised that tomorrow would be better. It was a promise she had no business making. A promise she couldn't guarantee, but she made it anyway because sometimes children needed promises more than they needed truth. Sometimes hope, even if it might prove false, was more sustaining than cold reality. The door chimed again and a woman in her 50s entered, snow dusting her dark coat. She had kind eyes and moved with the efficient purposefulness of someone who'd done this kind of work for decades. Her name was Patricia Rodriguez, and she ran a nonprofit that provided emergency assistance to families in crisis. Sarah had met her 2 years ago when she'd volunteered at a community meal program, and they'd stayed in touch in the vague way that people do when they recognize kindred spirits but don't have time to nurture friendship. Patricia slid into the booth next to Sarah, introducing herself to the boys with the kind of warm, no-nonsense manner that put them at ease. She didn't talk down to them or speak in the artificially sweet voice that some adults used with children. She treated them like the young people they were, explaining exactly what she could offer and what she needed from them. She could get their heat turned back on within 24 hours through an emergency fund. She could connect their grandmother with a food pantry and help her apply for energy assistance so this didn't happen again. But she needed their grandmother's permission to help, needed to talk to her and get her to sign some paperwork. Danny looked at Sarah, seeking guidance, and she nodded encouragingly. He gave Patricia their address and their grandmother's cell phone number, and Patricia made notes in a small leather-bound notebook. She promised she'd go to their apartment and wait for their grandmother to get home from work, that she'd explain everything and make it clear this wasn't about getting anyone in trouble. It was about getting them help they should have had access to all along. Then Patricia did something that surprised even Sarah. She reached into her purse and pulled out 2 paperback books, handing one to each boy. She told them she always carried books to give to kids she met, that stories were magic that could transport you somewhere warm and safe, even when your body was cold and scared. Mikey clutched his book, a tale about dragons, like it was treasure. Danny held his more carefully, but Sarah could see the hunger in his eyes as he read the back cover of the adventure story. Patricia stood, buttoning her coat and telling the boys she'd see them soon, that she'd make sure their grandmother knew what heroes they were for being so brave tonight. After she left, Danny looked at Sarah with an expression that was far too old for his 9 years. He thanked her, his voice cracking on the words, and Sarah had to blink hard against the sudden burning in her eyes. She told them they could stay until the snow let up a bit, until it was safer to walk home. She brought them paper and crayons from the kids' menu supplies, and they drew pictures while she worked, serving the few customers who braved the storm for coffee and pie. Marcus finally came out of the kitchen, taking in the scene with a raised eyebrow. But when Sarah met his gaze, he just shrugged and went back to his grill. Tony never emerged from his office, and Sarah sent a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever deity might be listening. At 9 o'clock, the snow finally began to taper off, and Danny announced they should probably head home. Sarah wrapped up 2 more sandwiches and some cookies in foil, telling them it was for their walk. She also slipped a $20 bill into Danny's coat pocket when he wasn't looking, knowing he'd protest if he saw it. As they prepared to leave, bundling back into their inadequate coats, Mikey surprised her by throwing his arms around her waist in a sudden, fierce hug. Sarah knelt down and hugged him back, then pulled Danny into the embrace too, holding these 2 boys who carried so much weight on such small shoulders. She walked them to the door and watched through the window as they trudged down the sidewalk, 2 small figures disappearing into the white landscape. She stood there long after they'd vanished from sight, her hand pressed against the cold glass, hoping desperately that Patricia would keep her promises, that tomorrow really would be better for them. She couldn't have known that while she was busy saving 2 boys from one kind of cold, another storm was gathering, one that would sweep into her life the next day and freeze everything she thought she knew about who she was and who she'd been running from. The morning shift started the way it always did, with Sarah arriving at 5:30 to help Marcus prep for the breakfast rush. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the city buried under 8 inches of white that gleamed pink and gold in the sunrise. The plows had been through, pushing mountains of snow onto the sidewalks, and Sarah had to climb over a waist-high bank to reach the diner's entrance. Inside, the warmth hit her like a wall, and she stomped the snow from her boots while Marcus grunted a greeting from the kitchen. She went through the motions of opening, the familiar ritual that had become her meditation over the past 3 years. She brewed coffee, filled sugar dispensers, checked that the ketchup bottles were full and the salt and pepper shakers were topped off. She moved with the efficiency of long practice, her mind drifting as her hands worked. She thought about Danny and Mikey, wondered if they'd made it home safely, if Patricia had managed to get their heat turned back on. She made a mental note to call Patricia later to follow up and make sure the boys were okay. The breakfast crowd filtered in slowly, hampered by the snow and the treacherous roads. There were the usual regulars, construction workers who always ordered the same thing and left decent tips, nurses coming off the night shift at the hospital 3 blocks away, and a handful of early risers who preferred the diner's coffee to whatever they could make at home. Sarah served them all with practiced efficiency, her smile automatic, her small talk minimal but friendly. She'd learned how to be present without being memorable, how to be helpful without inviting personal questions. It was a skill she'd honed to perfection, the art of being invisible while standing in plain sight. Around 8 o'clock, Tony emerged from his office with the morning receipts and a scowl. He caught Sarah's arm as she passed with a pot of coffee and asked her about the food she'd given away last night. Marcus had mentioned it, and Tony wanted to know what she was thinking, running a charity on his dime. Sarah felt her stomach drop, but she kept her face neutral and explained about the 2 boys, how they were freezing and starving, how she couldn't just turn them away. She offered to pay for the food out of her tips, knowing it would hurt, but knowing also that it was worth it. Tony stared at her for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. Then he sighed and waved his hand dismissively, telling her to forget it but warning her not to make a habit of it. He had a business to run, and he couldn't afford to feed every sob story that walked through the door. Sarah nodded, relief washing over her, and promised it wouldn't happen again. Tony grunted and returned to his office, but not before Sarah caught the smallest hint of approval in his eyes. He wasn't as hard as he pretended to be, and they both knew it. The morning wore on, the breakfast rush giving way to the late morning lull. Sarah was refilling the coffee station when the bell above the door chimed, and she looked up out of habit. What she saw made her blood turn to ice in her veins. The man who entered was tall and imposing, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. His overcoat was cashmere, his shoes Italian leather, and he carried himself with the kind of absolute confidence that came from never having been told no. But it wasn't his wealth or his bearing that stopped Sarah's heart, it was his face. She knew that face. She'd seen it in newspapers and magazines, on television and billboards. She'd seen it 3 years ago in a courtroom, carved in stone as he sat in the gallery watching her trial. Alexander Crane, CEO of Crane Industries, one of the wealthiest men in the state, possibly the country. And Sarah's husband, though that was a word that had ceased to have any meaning the day she'd walked away from him and everything he represented. Her maiden name was Sarah Mitchell, but for 2 years she'd been Sarah Crane, and she'd spent the 3 years since running from that identity as hard and as far as she could. Alexander's eyes swept the diner with the analytical gaze of someone who assessed everything and missed nothing. Sarah turned away quickly, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone in the diner could hear it. She ducked behind the counter, her hands shaking as she set down the coffee pot. This couldn't be happening, not here. Not now. She'd been so careful, had covered her tracks so thoroughly. She'd changed her name back to her maiden name, then changed it again to Chun, her grandmother's maiden name. She'd dyed her hair from blonde to dark brown, cut it short when it had been long. She'd moved across the country, gotten a job that didn't require background checks or references that could be traced. For 3 years, she'd been a ghost. And she'd thought she was safe. She'd thought Alexander had stopped looking for her, had written her off as a loss and moved on with his life. Clearly, she'd been wrong. Through the kitchen window, she could see Marcus watching her with concern, and she realized she must look as terrified as she felt. She forced herself to take a deep breath, to think rationally. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he didn't know she was here. Maybe he was just passing through, had stopped for coffee, and would leave without ever seeing her. She watched from her position behind the counter as he chose a booth, the same one where Danny and Mikey had sat the night before. He sat down with fluid grace and pulled out his phone, his attention apparently absorbed by whatever was on the screen. Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that she couldn't avoid him indefinitely. She was the only waitress on the floor, and someone needed to take his order. She considered asking Marcus to do it, but that would raise questions she couldn't answer. She thought about hiding in the bathroom until he left, but Tony would fire her on the spot if he caught her shirking her duties. There was nothing for it. She would have to go over there, take his order, and pray that he didn't recognize her. She looked different now, after all. The years had changed her, hollowed her cheeks and put shadows under her eyes. She dressed differently, moved differently, spoke differently. The Sarah Crane who had existed 3 years ago had been polished and poised, a society wife who wore designer clothes and attended charity galas. Sarah Chun was a waitress in a cheap uniform with tired eyes and rough hands. They were two different people. They had to be. Sarah grabbed a menu and a glass of water, her hands steady through sheer force of will. She walked across the diner on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. As she approached the booth, Alexander looked up from his phone, and his eyes met hers. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing, just the blank professional gaze of a customer looking at a waitress. Then something flickered in those ice blue eyes, something that might have been recognition or might have been nothing at all. Sarah couldn't tell, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She set the water down and asked him if he was ready to order, her voice coming out steady despite the chaos in her head. Alexander looked at her for another long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he ordered coffee, black, and the breakfast special. His voice was the same, deep and measured, the voice that had once whispered promises in the dark and later had cut her to ribbons with cold, calculated cruelty. Sarah wrote down the order, her pen moving across the pad by muscle memory alone, and told him it would be right out. She turned to leave, desperate to escape the intensity of his gaze, but his voice stopped her. He asked her name, and the question hung in the air like a guillotine blade waiting to fall. Sarah considered lying, but what was the point? If he knew, he knew. If he didn't, a false name wouldn't change anything. She told him her name was Sarah, her voice barely above a whisper. He repeated it, as if testing the weight of it, and thanked her. She fled to the kitchen, her composure cracking the moment she was out of sight. Marcus asked if she was okay, and she lied and said she was fine, just tired. She put Alexander's order in and then stood by the grill watching the eggs sizzle and trying to slow her racing heart. 3 years. She'd had 3 years of peace. 3 years of building a new life from the ashes of the old one. 3 years of believing she was free. And now Alexander Crane was sitting in Miller's diner, 15 feet away from her. And she had no idea if it was coincidence or if her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her ears. When the food was ready, she carried it to his table with hands that trembled despite her best efforts. She set the plate down and refilled his coffee, and he thanked her again, his eyes never leaving her face. She asked if there was anything else he needed, and he said no, that everything was perfect. She walked away feeling his gaze on her back like a physical weight, and she didn't dare look back. For the next 20 minutes, she busied herself with other tasks, refilling coffee for other customers, wiping down tables, doing anything to avoid going back to his booth. But eventually, inevitably, he was finished eating. He flagged her down and she had no choice but to approach. He asked for the check and she pulled it from her apron and set it on the table. He glanced at it, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a $100 bill, placing it on top of the check. His breakfast had cost $12. Sarah started to say she'd get his change, but he interrupted her, telling her to keep it. His voice was pleasant, conversational, but there was something underneath it, something sharp and knowing. Sarah stared at the $100 bill like it was a snake coiled on the table, ready to strike. This was a test. It had to be. Alexander never did anything without purpose, without layers of calculation behind every gesture. She wanted to refuse it, to tell him she didn't need his charity, but refusing would draw attention, would create a scene, would mark her as someone with a personal connection to this wealthy stranger. So she picked up the bill and the check, her fingers barely touching the money, and thanked him in the flat, professional tone she used with all customers. He stood, buttoning his coat with deliberate movements, and told her to have a good day. Then he walked out of the diner, the bell chiming his departure, and Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the floor, the $100 bill burning in her hand like a brand. Marcus called out to her, asking if she was going to clear the table or just stand there all morning, and the normalcy of his irritation snapped her back to reality. She cleared Alexander's dishes and wiped down the booth, moving on autopilot while her mind raced through possibilities and scenarios. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe he genuinely hadn't recognized her. 3 years was a long time, and people saw what they expected to see. A billionaire CEO didn't expect to find his missing wife serving eggs in a rundown diner, so perhaps his brain simply hadn't made the connection. The generous tip could have been exactly what it appeared to be: a wealthy man being careless with money that meant nothing to him. Sarah wanted desperately to believe this version of events, to convince herself that her secret was still safe, that her new life was still intact. But she knew Alexander too well. She'd been married to him for 2 years, had studied him the way a prey animal studies a predator, learning to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the minute changes in his tone that signaled danger. And in that moment when their eyes met, she'd seen something flicker in his gaze. Recognition. She was certain of it now. He knew exactly who she was. And the $100 bill wasn't generosity. It was a message. It said, "I found you." It said, "I know where you work." It said, "I can reach you whenever I want." The rest of her shift passed in a blur of anxiety and forced normalcy. She served customers, cleared tables, made small talk, and went through all the familiar motions while her thoughts spiraled in increasingly dark directions. She kept expecting Alexander to return, to walk back through that door with police or lawyers or worse. But the lunch rush came and went, and he didn't reappear. By the time her shift ended at 2 o'clock, Sarah was wound so tight she thought she might shatter. She changed out of her uniform in the cramped employee bathroom, pulling on jeans and a sweater, her winter coat and boots. She stood in front of the spotted mirror, studying her reflection with critical eyes. She did look different from the woman she'd been. That woman had been carefully maintained, her hair highlighted and styled, her skin treated with expensive creams, her body kept trim with personal trainers and yoga classes. The woman in the mirror now had darker hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, eyes circled with shadows from too many late shifts and too little sleep, and a body that was thin from stress rather than design. But the bone structure was the same. The shape of her face, the line of her jaw, the color of her eyes. Those things couldn't be changed with dye and different clothes. If Alexander had been looking for her, if he'd had investigators tracking her movements, tracing her steps, then no amount of camouflage would have been enough. Sarah left the diner through the back entrance, a habit she'd developed over the years, always checking her surroundings, always aware of who might be watching. The alley behind the diner was empty except for overflowing dumpsters and the skeletal remains of last summer's weeds poking through the snow. She walked the 6 blocks to her apartment building, her breath forming white clouds in the cold air. The streets were still icy despite the morning sun, and she picked her way carefully over frozen patches, her mind only half on the physical act of walking. The other half was 3 years in the past, remembering the day she'd decided to leave, the day everything had changed. She'd been married to Alexander for 18 months when she'd discovered the truth about who he really was, what he was capable of. She'd known from the beginning that he was ruthless in business, that you didn't build an empire like Crane Industries by being nice or playing fair. But there was a difference between ruthless business practices and the things she'd found in his private office. The files documenting bribes paid to city officials, environmental regulations circumvented, safety violations covered up. The reports from private investigators detailing the personal lives of his rivals, their vulnerabilities, their secrets, everything that could be used as leverage or blackmail, and worst of all, the photographs. Images of people who had stood in Alexander's way or betrayed his trust, people who had subsequently met with unfortunate accidents. A whistleblower who'd died in a hit and run, a competitor who'd succumbed to a sudden heart attack, a journalist who'd committed suicide just before publishing an expose. Maybe they were all coincidences. Maybe Sarah's suspicions were unfounded, the paranoid imaginings of a woman who'd realized too late that she'd married a stranger. But the pattern was there, undeniable in its consistency. People who threatened Alexander's interests had a way of disappearing or dying, and Sarah had seen enough to know that coincidences of that magnitude didn't exist. She'd made copies of everything, hidden them in 3 different locations, her insurance policy. Then she'd begun planning her escape. It had taken her 3 months to execute. 3 months of pretending everything was fine, of playing the role of dutiful wife while she slowly, carefully diverted money from her personal accounts into untraceable prepaid cards. 3 months of establishing a new identity, getting fake documents from contacts she'd made through her pro bono legal work before marrying Alexander. 3 months of living in fear that he would discover what she was planning and that she would become another unfortunate wake. She'd left on a Tuesday morning while he was at a board meeting. She'd walked out of their penthouse with a single suitcase and never looked back. She'd driven west, stopping in cheap motels and paying cash, ditching her car in Nevada and buying another one under her new name. She'd kept moving for months, working temporary jobs, waitressing and bartending, always ready to run again if she caught even a hint that he'd found her trail. Eventually, she'd ended up here in this mid-sized city that was big enough to disappear in but small enough to feel manageable. She'd thought she was safe. She'd let herself believe that Alexander had let her go. that a man of his wealth and power had more important things to worry about than one woman who'd walked away. She'd been stupid. She knew now how stupid she'd been. Men like Alexander didn't let go. They didn't forget, and they certainly didn't forgive. Her apartment building was a 3-story brick structure that had been converted from a factory decades ago. The hallways smelled of cooking and old carpet, and the radiators clanked and hissed but provided adequate heat. Sarah climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, her legs heavy with exhaustion and dread. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, automatically checking the small pieces of tape she'd placed on the doorframe, markers that would tell her if anyone had entered while she was gone. They were undisturbed. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it that morning, small and sparse but clean and safe. She locked the door behind her, engaged the deadbolt in the chain and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her fear. Her hands were shaking, her breath coming in short gasps that felt dangerously close to hyperventilation. She made herself move, forced herself to walk to the kitchen and pour a glass of water. She drank it slowly, the cold liquid helping to clear her head. She needed to think, needed to plan. The question was whether Alexander's appearance at the diner was the first move in a larger strategy, or simply reconnaissance. If he knew where she worked, did he also know where she lived? The thought made her skin crawl. She went to her bedroom and pulled the go bag from the back of her closet. The emergency kit she'd maintained even after settling in here. Cash, a change of clothes, copies of her documents, everything she'd need to disappear again. But could she run? Where would she go? She'd been running for 3 years, and it had brought her exactly nowhere except back into Alexander's orbit. Maybe running wasn't the answer anymore. Maybe it was time to stand and fight, to use those insurance files she'd hidden to expose Alexander for what he was. The thought terrified her, but it also sparked something else, something that felt almost like hope. She'd been hiding for so long, living in fear, looking over her shoulder at every turn. Perhaps it was time to stop being prey and become something else. Sarah sat on her bed, the go bag in her lap, and tried to think through her options with the clear, analytical mind she'd honed in law school before Alexander had convinced her to quit and focus on being his wife. She could run, disappear again, but with diminishing returns each time. She could stay and pretend nothing had happened, hope that Alexander's visit was just a warning shot and that he'd leave her alone if she kept her head down. Or she could confront him, use the evidence she had to ensure her safety. Each option carried risks. Each could end with her dead or worse. Her phone rang, the shrill sound cutting through the silence and making her jump. She pulled it from her pocket and looked at the screen. Unknown number. Her first instinct was to ignore it, but something made her answer. She lifted the phone to her ear and said hello, her voice steadier than she felt. The voice on the other end was warm and familiar, and for a moment Sarah's fear receded slightly. It was Patricia Rodriguez calling to update her on Danny and Mikey. The boys' heat had been restored that morning, and their grandmother had been connected with emergency food assistance and energy support programs. Patricia thanked Sarah for calling her, said that without Sarah's intervention, those boys might have frozen to death or worse. The words settled over Sarah like a blanket, warm and solid. She'd helped them. Despite everything else falling apart in her life, despite the fear and the uncertainty, she'd made a difference for 2 children who'd needed her. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. After she hung up with Patricia, Sarah sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment, the winter afternoon fading to evening outside her window. She thought about Danny and Mikey, about their bravery and resilience. They hadn't given up even when everything was stacked against them. They'd kept going, kept fighting, kept surviving. Maybe she could do the same. Maybe she was stronger than she'd given herself credit for. She'd survived Alexander once, survived leaving him and building a new life from nothing. She could survive whatever came next. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the building around her. Footsteps in the hallway, pipes groaning, the couple next door arguing, and muffled voices through the thin walls. Every sound made her tense, made her wonder if this was it, if Alexander had sent people to take her back, to silence her, to make her disappear the way so many others had disappeared. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through her window, she was almost relieved. At least the waiting was over. At least she could face another day and whatever it might bring. She dressed in her uniform and walked to the diner through streets that were still icy from yesterday's storm. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, but the air was bitter cold and her breath came in white plumes. She arrived early before Marcus and let herself in with her key. The diner was dark and silent, and she moved through it like a ghost, turning on lights, starting coffee, preparing for the morning rush. The routine was comforting, familiar, a tether to normalcy when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, grunting his usual greeting, and they worked in companionable silence as the diner came to life around them. The first customers trickled in, early risers and night shift workers grabbing breakfast before heading home to sleep. Sarah served them all with automatic efficiency, her mind only half present, the other half constantly scanning the door, waiting for Alexander to return. But the breakfast rush came and went, and he didn't appear. Neither did anyone else who seemed out of place or suspicious. By mid-morning, Sarah had almost convinced herself that yesterday had been an isolated incident, that Alexander had satisfied his curiosity and moved on. Then the door chimed, and her heart stopped. But it wasn't Alexander. It was Danny and Mikey, bundled in the same threadbare coats, but this time accompanied by an older woman who could only be their grandmother. She was short and round, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and tired eyes that held the weight of the world. She spotted Sarah immediately and made a beeline for the counter. the boys trailing behind her. The grandmother introduced herself as Maria Santos, and her voice was thick with emotion as she thanked Sarah for what she'd done for her grandsons. She said Patricia had told her everything, how Sarah had fed the boys and kept them safe, how she'd called for help instead of calling the authorities. Maria gripped Sarah's hands across the counter, her callous palms warm and strong, and told her she'd been working herself sick with worry about how to keep the boys fed and warm, that she'd felt like she was failing them every day. The heat was back on now thanks to Patricia's emergency fund, and they had food in the pantry and hope for the first time in months. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, the first real emotion she'd allowed herself since Alexander's appearance yesterday. She told Maria it was nothing, that anyone would have done the same. But Maria shook her head firmly. But not anyone, she insisted. Most people looked right through children like Danny and Mikey, saw them as problems to be avoided or reported rather than people who needed help. Sarah had seen them as human beings, had treated them with dignity and kindness, and that made all the difference. Danny and Mikey stood behind their grandmother, beaming with pride, and Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. Some frozen part of her heart that she'd kept locked away for 3 years. Maria insisted on buying breakfast for all three of them, pulling a carefully counted stack of bills from her purse, and Sarah rang them up and seated them in the same booth where the boys had sat 2 nights ago. She brought them coffee and juice and took their orders, and as she walked away she caught Mikey's eye. He waved at her with a shy smile and she waved back, feeling lighter than she had in days. This was why she'd left Alexander, why she'd run and hidden and rebuilt her life from scratch, because there was more to existence than power and money and control. There was kindness and connection and the simple act of helping someone who needed it. The rest of the morning passed quickly and Sarah found herself smiling more genuinely than she had in recent memory. Maria and the boys stayed for almost an hour, the grandmother telling them stories about her childhood in Puerto Rico, the boys laughing and eating with the unself-conscious joy of children who felt safe and loved. When they finally left, Maria hugged Sarah goodbye and pressed something into her hand, a small medal on a chain. It was St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers in protection. Maria told her to keep it, that Sarah had protected her boys when she couldn't, and now maybe the saint would protect Sarah in return. Sarah clutched the medal, feeling the weight of it in her palm, and promised Maria she would treasure it. After they left, she tucked it into her pocket, a small talisman against whatever darkness was coming. The lunch rush began, and Sarah was in the middle of taking an order when the door chimed again. This time, when she looked up, her blood ran cold. Alexander had returned, but he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by 2 other men in expensive suits, clearly lawyers or executives, and a woman in a tailored dress who carried herself with the predatory elegance of a shark. They took the largest booth, and Sarah felt every eye in the diner turn toward them. They radiated wealth and power, and they were completely out of place in this working-class establishment. Tony emerged from his office, drawn by the disturbance in the usual atmosphere, and he shot Sarah a questioning look. She gave him a slight shake of her head, hoping he'd stay back, and approached the booth with her order pad in hand, her professional mask firmly in place. She asked if they were ready to order, her voice steady, and Alexander looked up at her with those ice-blue eyes that she'd once thought were beautiful and now knew were empty. He introduced his companions, though Sarah barely registered their names. The lawyers were there for a business meeting, he explained, and he'd told them this was the best diner in the city. It was a lie. A performance, and Sarah wondered who it was for. Was he establishing her location for his associates, making sure there were witnesses to the fact that he'd found her? Or was this some elaborate game, a cat playing with a mouse before the final strike? She took their orders, her hands steady as she wrote, and returned to the kitchen to submit the tickets. Marcus watched her from the grill, concern evident in his expression. He asked if those suits were giving her trouble, if he needed to intervene, and Sarah shook her head. They were just customers, she told him, just people passing through. Another lie, but what else could she say? She couldn't explain that the man in the charcoal suit was her husband, that she'd been hiding from him for 3 years, that his presence here meant her carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down. She couldn't burden Marcus or Tony with that knowledge, couldn't pull them into the dangerous orbit of Alexander Crane. She delivered the food when it was ready, moving efficiently from the kitchen to the booth and back again, never making eye contact with Alexander, never giving him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. But she could feel his attention on her, constant and assessing, and she knew this was deliberate. He was letting her know that he could find her anytime, anywhere, that there was no place she could hide that he couldn't reach. The message was clear, and it was working. Her hands shook when she was out of sight, and her heart raced with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. The meeting at the booth stretched on for over an hour, and Sarah had to return multiple times to refill coffee and water, to clear plates and bring dessert. Each trip was an agony of forced composure, and by the time they finally asked for the check, she felt wrung out and exhausted. Alexander paid with a credit card, signing the receipt with a flourish, and once again he left an absurdly large tip. $200 this time, double yesterday's amount. The escalation was intentional, she knew. Each tip was a reminder of the wealth and power he commanded, resources she could never hope to match. As they stood to leave, Alexander caught her eye one final time. He thanked her for the excellent service, his voice pleasant and cordial, and told her he'd likely be back tomorrow. The threat was barely veiled. He was establishing a pattern, making it clear that this wasn't a one-time occurrence. He would keep coming back, keep inserting himself into her new life until she broke or ran or gave him whatever it was he wanted from her. Sarah nodded and thanked him for his business, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, and watched as he and his entourage left the diner. The moment they were gone, her legs nearly gave out. She caught herself on the edge of the counter, breathing hard, and Tony appeared at her elbow with a glass of water. He told her to sit down, that she looked like she was about to pass out, and Sarah obeyed, sinking onto a stool while the diner continued to bustle around her. Tony stood there, arms crossed, studying her with the shrewd gaze of a man who'd seen every kind of trouble walk through his door. He asked if she knew those men, if they were bothering her, and Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could lie, could maintain her cover and keep pretending everything was fine, or she could tell the truth, or at least part of it, and maybe find an ally in this fight she was suddenly facing alone. Sarah looked at Tony, this gruff, kind man who'd given her a job when she desperately needed one, who'd overlooked her lack of references and asked no questions about her past. She owed him something, even if it wasn't the whole truth. She told him that the man in the charcoal suit was someone from her past, someone she'd left behind and hoped never to see again. She admitted that his appearance here meant trouble, though she didn't specify what kind. Tony listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, processing. Then he told her that whatever trouble she was in, she didn't have to face it alone. He said he had friends, connections, people who owed him favors. If she needed help, real help, she should ask. The offer was unexpected and touching, and Sarah felt emotion well up in her throat. She thanked him, her voice thick, and promised she would be careful. Tony nodded, patted her shoulder awkwardly, and returned to his office, leaving Sarah sitting at the counter with the weight of his kindness settling over her like armor. That evening, Sarah did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She called her sister. Emily was 2 years younger, a graphic designer living in Portland, and they'd been close once, before Sarah had married Alexander and slowly drifted away from everyone who'd known her before. Sarah had cut off contact completely when she'd run, knowing that Alexander would watch her family and friends, would use them to track her movements. But now she needed someone who knew her, really knew her, who could remind her of who she'd been before Alexander had tried to remake her in his image. The phone rang 4 times before Emily answered, and when she heard Sarah's voice, there was a sharp intake of breath. Sarah could picture her sister's face, the shock and relief and anger all warring for dominance. Emily's first words were a fierce demand to know if Sarah was okay, where she'd been, why she'd disappeared without a word. Sarah sat on her apartment floor, her back against the bed, and told her sister everything. She talked for an hour, the words pouring out in a torrent that she couldn't have stopped if she'd wanted to. She told Emily about the files she'd found, the evidence of corruption, and worse. She explained why she'd run, why she'd had to cut off contact, how she'd been protecting Emily by staying away. She described the past 3 years, the constant fear and vigilance, the way she'd rebuilt herself from nothing. And finally, she told her about Alexander's reappearance, about the threat implicit in his repeated visits to the diner. Emily listened to all of it, and when Sarah finally fell silent, exhausted, and wrung out, her sister's response was immediate and fierce. Emily told Sarah to come to Portland, to get on a bus tonight and disappear again. She offered her apartment, her spare room, whatever Sarah needed to stay safe. But Sarah found herself shaking her head even though Emily couldn't see her. Running hadn't worked, she said. 3 years of running had only delayed the inevitable. Alexander had found her, and he would find her again no matter where she went. The only way to truly be free was to stop running and start fighting. She had the evidence still, hidden in safety deposit boxes in 3 different cities. She had proof of what Alexander had done, documentation that could destroy him if she had the courage to use it. Emily was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Sarah had been avoiding. What did Alexander want? That was the piece that didn't fit. If he'd found her, if he knew where she worked, why the elaborate performance? Why not just have her dragged back to their penthouse, or worse, why sit in a diner drinking coffee and leaving enormous tips? Sarah admitted she didn't know, and that uncertainty terrified her more than anything else. Alexander was methodical, strategic. Every move he made served a purpose. The fact that she couldn't see his endgame meant she was missing something crucial. Her sister suggested that maybe he wanted her to run again, that maybe the psychological torture was the point. If Sarah bolted, disappeared into the night, she'd be proving that she was still under his control, still reactive to his whims. Or maybe he was gathering evidence of his own, documenting her new life and new identity to use against her somehow. Emily's theories were plausible, but none of them felt quite right. Sarah knew Alexander better than anyone, knew how his mind worked. This wasn't about control or documentation. This was personal. He was angry and he wanted her to know it. They talked until late into the night, and when they finally hung up, Sarah felt marginally better. She wasn't alone anymore. Emily knew where she was, what she was facing, and had promised to help however she could. It was a small comfort, but it was something. Sarah lay in bed that night with St. Christopher's medal clutched in her hand, and for the first time in days she slept, though her dreams were troubled and dark. Morning came too quickly, and with it the dreaded knowledge that Alexander would likely return to the diner, continuing his pattern of calculated intimidation. Sarah dressed and walked to work through streets that sparkled with fresh frost, the world beautiful and deadly in equal measure. She arrived to find Marcus already there, and he took one look at her face and made her a proper breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee, insisting she eat before her shift started. She protested weakly, but he wouldn't hear it, and she found herself sitting at the counter consuming food she didn't want while Marcus worked the grill and hummed tunelessly. The simple act of being cared for, even in such a small way, gave her strength she hadn't known she needed. The morning rush began, and Sarah threw herself into work, grateful for the distraction. She served regulars and strangers alike, refilled coffee and cleared table, tried not to watch the door. But at 9:30, right on schedule, Alexander walked in. This time he was alone, no lawyers or executives to witness whatever game he was playing. He took the same booth he'd occupied the first day, and Sarah approached with her order pad and a calm she didn't feel. He ordered coffee and the breakfast special again, his choices identical to that first encounter. And Sarah wondered if that too was intentional, a recreation of the moment he'd found her. She brought his food and coffee and tried to leave quickly, but his voice stopped her. He asked her to sit down, said they needed to talk. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain the pretense of professional distance, but she realized that confrontation was inevitable. Better here in a public place with witnesses than somewhere private where Alexander had all the advantages. She slid into the booth across from him, her hands folded on the table, her expression neutral. He studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes cataloging every detail, every change the years had wrought. He told her she looked different, and not in a complimentary way. The observation was calculated to wound, to remind her of everything she'd lost when she'd left him. Sarah refused to take the bait. She asked him what he wanted, her voice steady, and Alexander smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He said he wanted to understand why she'd run, why she'd thrown away everything they'd built together. The question was absurd, almost laughable. She'd left because she'd discovered he was a monster, because staying had meant becoming complicit in his crimes. But Alexander seemed genuinely puzzled, as if her moral objections were incomprehensible to him. Sarah realized then that this was the fundamental disconnect between them. Alexander truly didn't understand what he'd done wrong. In his worldview, power justified any action, and success absolved all sin. The people he'd destroyed were simply casualties of business, regrettable perhaps, but ultimately necessary. He'd expected her to accept this, to embrace the lifestyle his money provided, and asked no questions about where that money came from or what it cost. Her refusal to do so had baffled and offended him in equal measure. She tried to explain this to him, to articulate the moral chasm that separated them, but he dismissed her words with a wave of his hand. He told her she'd always been too soft, too idealistic, that the world didn't work the way she wanted it to. He said he'd been willing to overlook her naivete when they'd married because she'd been beautiful and intelligent, and looked perfect on his arm at social functions. But her disappearance had been embarrassing, had damaged his reputation, had made him look weak and unable to control his own household. That, more than anything, was what he couldn't forgive. Not her moral objections or her rejection of him, but the public humiliation of a wife who'd walked away. Sarah felt something cold and hard settle in her stomach as she listened to him. This wasn't about love or loss or even revenge in the traditional sense. This was about image, about the narrative Alexander needed to maintain for the world. He'd spent 3 years looking for her, not because he missed her or wanted her back, but because her absence was a stain on his carefully crafted persona. He needed to resolve the Sarah situation, to write an ending to their story that restored his image and erased the embarrassment she'd caused. The question was what ending he had in mind. She asked him directly what he planned to do now that he'd found her. His answer was chilling in its simplicity. He said she had two choices. She could come back, or resume her role as his wife, and they would tell everyone she'd had a breakdown but was now recovered. He would forgive her publicly, demonstrate his magnanimity, and everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be. Or she could refuse, in which case he would destroy this new life she'd built just as thoroughly as he'd destroyed everyone else who'd opposed him. He would have her arrested for stealing from him, produce evidence she'd never seen of financial impropriety. He would expose her fake identity, ruin her reputation, make sure she could never work again. The threat was delivered in the same pleasant, conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather, and that made it all the more terrifying. Sarah looked across the table at this man she'd once promised to love and honor, and saw nothing human in his eyes. He was a machine, calculating and cold, and she'd been a fool to think running would be enough to escape him. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, she felt something else rising up to meet it. Anger. Pure, righteous fury at this man who thought he could control her, could dictate her choices, could force her back into a cage of his making. She told him no. The word came out quiet but firm, and Alexander's expression flickered, surprise breaking through his composure for just a moment. She said she would never come back to him, never pretend their marriage had been anything other than a mistake. She told him to do his worst, to come after her with lawyers and fake evidence and all the considerable resources at his disposal. She would fight him every step of the way, and she had weapons of her own that he'd never expected her to acquire. The files she'd copied, the evidence of his crime, she still had all of it, and if he pushed her, she would go public with everything. For a long moment, Alexander simply stared at her, his face unreadable. Then something shifted in his expression, something dark and dangerous that made Sarah's blood run cold. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, and told her she had no idea what she was threatening. Those files, if they even existed, would implicate her too. She'd been his wife, had lived in his house, had benefited from the money his business generated. Any prosecutor would argue she'd been complicit, at minimum, willfully blind to his activities. If she destroyed him, she would destroy herself in the process. The argument was calculated to paralyze her, to make her doubt her own position, and Sarah felt the familiar tendrils of fear creeping in. But then she thought of Danny and Mikey, two boys who'd faced impossible odds and kept fighting anyway. She thought of Maria, working herself to exhaustion to protect her grandsons. She thought of all the people Alexander had hurt over the years, the lives he'd ruined in his relentless pursuit of power and profit. If standing against him meant sacrificing herself, then so be it. Some things were worth the cost. She told Alexander she didn't care what happened to her, that she would rather go to prison than live one more day under his control. The statement was brave and true, and she saw it land like a physical blow. Alexander wasn't accustomed to people who couldn't be bought or threatened or manipulated. His entire empire was built on understanding what people wanted and using that knowledge as leverage. But Sarah wanted nothing he could offer, and that made her uniquely dangerous to him. She stood up from the booth, her legs steady beneath her, and told him their conversation was over. She had work to do, and he was no longer welcome in her diner. Alexander's face hardened into a mask of cold fury, and for a moment Sarah thought he might do something violent right there in the middle of the breakfast rush. But he controlled himself, standing with deliberate calm and straightening his coat. He told her this wasn't finished, that she would regret choosing to oppose him. Then he walked out, and Sarah stood watching him go, her heart pounding but her resolve solid. She'd declared war on one of the most powerful men in the state, and there was no taking it back now. The rest of the day passed in a haze of adrenaline and anxiety. Sarah moved through her shift mechanically, serving customers and clearing tables while her mind raced through scenarios and consequences. Tony pulled her aside during the lunch lull and asked if everything was all right, if the suit had given her trouble. Sarah assured him she'd handled it, though she could see the doubt in his eyes. Marcus watched her with concern throughout the afternoon, and even the regular customers seemed to sense something was off, the usual friendly banter replaced by careful courtesy. When her shift finally ended, Sarah changed out of her uniform and stepped into the cold afternoon air, feeling like she was walking into an ambush. She scanned the street for suspicious cars or unfamiliar faces, her senses heightened to the point of paranoia. The 6-block walk to her apartment felt like 6 miles, every shadow a potential threat, every person she passed a possible danger, but she made it home without incident, locked herself inside, and collapsed onto her bed fully clothed, shaking with the aftermath of sustained terror. She must have dozed off because she woke to darkness and the sound of her phone ringing. She fumbled for it, her heart racing, and saw Emily's name on the screen. Her sister had been calling every few hours since their conversation, checking in, making sure Sarah was safe. Sarah answered and assured Emily she was fine, though her voice must have betrayed her because Emily immediately demanded to know what had happened. Sarah recounted the confrontation with Alexander, his ultimatum, and her refusal. Emily's response was a string of colorful profanity followed by fierce pride that Sarah had stood her ground. But then Emily asked the question Sarah had been avoiding. What happened next? Alexander wouldn't accept defiance quietly, and Sarah had essentially dared him to retaliate. Emily wanted to know if Sarah had a plan, a strategy for the battle she'd just initiated. Sarah admitted she didn't. Not really. She had the files, the evidence, but using them meant going public. And going public meant exposing herself to scrutiny and potential criminal charges. It was mutually assured destruction, a weapon she could only use once and only if she was willing to accept the fallout. Emily suggested they contact a journalist, someone who could break the story and provide Sarah with some protection through publicity. The idea had merit, but it also terrified her. Once that bell was rung, it couldn't be unrung. Her life would become a media circus, every detail of her marriage and escape dissected for public consumption. She would lose her anonymity, her privacy, everything she'd built over the past 3 years. But she would also be free of Alexander's shadow, permanently and irrevocably. It was a trade Sarah wasn't sure she was ready to make. They were still discussing options when Sarah heard a sound in the hallway outside her apartment, footsteps that stopped directly outside her door. She went silent, gripping the phone, and Emily immediately picked up on the change, asking what was wrong. Sarah whispered that someone was outside, and Emily told her to call the police, to not open the door. But before Sarah could do anything, there was a knock, firm and authoritative. A voice came through the door, identifying itself as building security, saying there had been a complaint about a disturbance in her apartment. Sarah knew it was a lie. She'd been silent all evening, and her neighbors had no reason to complain. This was Alexander's doing, another escalation in his campaign against her. She told Emily to stay on the line and approached the door carefully, looking through the peephole. What she saw made her stomach drop. 2 large men in security uniforms stood in the hallway, but behind them, partially obscured by their bodies, was Alexander. He'd brought muscle, and the pretense of a noise complaint was just a ruse to get her to open the door. Sarah backed away from the door, her mind racing. If she didn't open it, they might break it down. If she did open it, Alexander would force his way in, and whatever happened next would happen without witnesses. She needed help. Needed someone to intervene, but who could she call? The police would take too long, and by the time they arrived, Alexander would have spun some story about a concerned husband trying to help his mentally unstable wife. She thought of Tony and his offer of help, of friends and connections, but she didn't have his number and didn't know how to reach him. The knocking came again, louder and more insistent. The voice demanded she open the door immediately or they would enter by force. Sarah made a split-second decision. She grabbed her go-bag from the closet, still packed from days ago, and went to her bedroom window. The fire escape was old and rusty, and she'd never tested it, but it was her only option. She told Emily what she was doing, and her sister begged her to be careful to keep the phone on. Sarah promised she would, tucked the phone into her pocket, and pushed open the window. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she could hear the sounds of the city below, traffic and voices and the distant wail of sirens. She climbed out onto the fire escape, the metal freezing against her hands, and started down. Behind her, she heard a crash as her apartment door gave way, heard Alexander's voice shouting her name. She moved faster, her feet slipping on ice-covered rungs, her bag banging against her back. She made it to the second-floor landing when she heard them at her window. Alexander's face appearing in the opening, his expression twisted with rage. She jumped the last 6 feet to the alley below, landing hard and rolling to absorb the impact. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself up and started running, limping heavily, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear them behind her, could hear the clang of feet on the fire escape, and she pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain. She burst out of the alley onto the street, nearly getting hit by a taxi, and kept going, weaving through pedestrians who shouted in annoyance. She had no destination, no plan, only the primal need to escape. 3 blocks later, her lungs burning and her ankles screaming, she ducked into the first open door she saw. It was a corner store, bright and warm, with a bored teenager behind the counter playing on his phone. Saray stumbled to the back of the store, trying to catch her breath, trying to think. She pulled out her phone and saw that Emily was still on the line, her sister's frantic voice asking if she was okay. Sarah gasped out that she'd gotten away, that she was in a store, but she didn't know for how long. She needed a plan, needed somewhere safe to go. Emily told her to get to the bus station, to buy a ticket to anywhere and get out of the city tonight. Sarah knew it was good advice, knew that staying was suicide, but something held her back. If she ran now, Alexander won. He got to drive her from her home, from her job, from the small piece of life she'd carved out for herself. He got to chase her across the country indefinitely, and she would never stop looking over her shoulder. The cycle would continue forever unless she broke it, and the only way to break it was to stand and fight. She told Emily she wasn't running, that she had a different idea. She was going to Miller's Diner. Tony had offered help, had promised resources and connections, and Sarah was going to take him up on it. More than that, the diner was public, was full of witnesses, was the one place in the city that felt like home. If Alexander wanted to confront her, let him do it there, in front of people who knew her, who might stand with her. Emily protested, said it was too dangerous, but Sarah had made up her mind. She thanked her sister for everything, promised to call again soon, and hung up. She waited in the corner store for 10 minutes, watching the street through the window, making sure Alexander and his men had moved on. Then she left, keeping to well-lit areas and busy streets, making her way toward the diner. Her ankle throbbed with every step, and her hands were scraped and bleeding from the fire escape, but she felt strangely calm. The decision had been made. The die was cast. Whatever happened next would happen at Miller's Diner, the place where she'd fed 2 hungry boys and inadvertently set all of this in motion. The diner was busy when Sarah arrived, the dinner rush in full swing. Through the windows she could see every booth occupied, the counter lined with customers, Marcus working the grill while a waitress named Jennifer handled the floor. Sarah had never been so grateful to see the familiar chaos of the evening shift. She pushed through the door, the bell chiming her arrival, and Jennifer looked up with surprise. Sarah wasn't scheduled to work tonight, and her appearance, disheveled and limping with a bag over her shoulder, clearly raised questions. Tony emerged from his office almost immediately, drawn by Jennifer's concerned expression. He took one look at Sarah, and his face hardened with understanding. He didn't ask questions, just guided her to a booth in the back corner, away from the windows and the main flow of traffic. He told Jennifer to bring coffee and water, then slid into the seat across from Sarah and waited. His patience was a gift, and Sarah took a moment to gather her thoughts, to figure out how much to tell and how much to hold back. But looking at Tony's weathered, kind face, she realized she was tired of secrets and half-truths. She told him everything. She started with her marriage to Alexander Crane, how she'd discovered his criminal activities and fled. She explained the 3 years of running and hiding, the false identities and constant fear. She described Alexander's reappearance at the diner, his ultimatum that morning, and the attempted forced entry at her apartment just an hour ago. She showed him her scraped hands and swollen ankle as evidence of her escape down the fire escape. She admitted she had nowhere else to go, no plan beyond getting to the diner and hoping Tony's offer of help had been genuine. Tony listened to all of it without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Sarah finally fell silent, exhausted from the telling, he sat back and ran a hand over his face. He told her she should have come to him sooner, should have trusted him with the truth from the beginning, but he understood why she hadn't, understood the particular prison that fear could build around a person. He said he'd meant what he'd told her before about having connections, and now he was going to use them. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in low tones to someone on the other end. While Tony talked, Jennifer brought coffee and a first aid kit, clearly having been briefed on the situation. She cleaned and bandaged Sarah's hands with gentle efficiency, asking no questions but offering quiet solidarity. Sarah sipped her coffee and watched the diner around her. The normal people having normal meals. Their biggest concerns probably what to order for dessert or whether they'd left enough money for parking. She envied them their ordinary lives, their freedom from the kind of fear that had defined her existence for so long. Tony finished his call and told Sarah that help was coming. He'd contacted a friend who worked in law enforcement, someone he trusted, absolutely. This friend had connections to the FBI and could fast-track Sarah's evidence into the right hands. If her files were as damning as she claimed, they could open an investigation into Alexander within days. But Tony warned her that once she went down that road, there was no turning back. Her life would become public record, and she would likely face intense scrutiny herself. Sarah told him she understood that she'd already made peace with those consequences. Anything was better than continuing to run. The friend arrived 20 minutes later, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the no-nonsense bearing of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. Her name was Detective Margaret Walsh, recently retired from the city police force but still consulting on major cases. Tony introduced them, and Margaret slid into the booth next to Sarah, her presence immediately commanding and reassuring. She asked Sarah to tell her story again from the beginning, and Sarah complied, though this time Margaret interrupted frequently with specific questions about dates, locations, and the nature of the evidence Sarah possessed. When Sarah mentioned the files, Margaret's interest sharpened visibly. She wanted to know exactly what documentation Sarah had, where it was stored, and whether it would hold up under legal scrutiny. Sarah explained that she had copies of financial records showing bribes and money laundering, internal memos discussing illegal activities, and most damning of all, surveillance reports on the people who had subsequently died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. She'd hidden the files in safety deposit boxes in 3 different cities, accessible only with keys she kept on her person and passwords she'd memorized. Margaret pulled out a notebook and started taking detailed notes. She explained that what Sarah had could indeed be enough to launch a federal investigation, possibly even a RICO case against Alexander and his entire organization. But building that case would take time, and in the meantime, Sarah was in immediate danger. Alexander had already demonstrated his willingness to use force, and now that Sarah had openly defied him, he would escalate. Margaret said she could arrange for protective custody. Could have Sarah moved to a safe house while the investigation proceeded, but Sarah shook her head. She'd spent 3 years hiding, and she was done. She wanted to stay here, in the diner, in the community she'd built. Margaret frowned, clearly unhappy with this plan, but Sarah was adamant. She argued that Alexander was less likely to do something violent in public, surrounded by witnesses. The diner offered protection through visibility, and Sarah had people here who cared about her, who would stand with her. Margaret exchanged a glance with Tony, who nodded his agreement. He said the diner had cameras, had regular customers who were cops and firefighters, had a community that looked after its own. If Sarah wanted to make her stand here, he would support her. Margaret relented, though she insisted on certain conditions. She would have plainclothes officers stationed nearby, ready to intervene if Alexander showed up. She would personally review Sarah's evidence and begin the process of getting it into federal hands. And Sarah had to promise that if the situation became untenable, if Alexander's threats escalated to the point where her life was in immediate danger, she would accept protective custody without argument. Sarah agreed to these terms, feeling something like hope stirring in her chest for the first time in years. They were finalizing the details when the diner's door opened and Danny and Mikey walked in, followed by their grandmother Maria. The boys spotted Sarah immediately and rushed over, their faces lighting up with excitement. They wanted to show her something, pulling pieces of paper from their backpacks with the pride of children sharing their achievements. Danny had gotten an A on his math test, and Mikey had drawn a picture that his teacher had hung on the classroom wall. Maria followed behind them, smiling at their enthusiasm, then noticed Sarah's bandaged hands and the serious expressions of the adults at the table. Her smile faded to concern, and she asked if everything was all right. Sarah assured her it was, introducing Margaret and explaining vaguely that she was dealing with some personal issues but that everything would be fine. Maria looked skeptical but didn't press, instead turning her attention to ordering dinner for herself and the boys. As they moved to their own booth, Danny looked back at Sarah with worry in his young eyes, and she gave him what she hoped was a reassuring smile. These boys and their grandmother had become important to her in the short time she'd known them, a reminder of why she'd left Alexander in the first place, why some things were worth fighting for. The evening wore on, and the diner gradually emptied as customers finished their meals and headed home. Margaret left to begin working her contacts, promising to return the next day with updates. Tony stayed, sitting at the counter nursing coffee and keeping watch over the diner like a sentinel. Jennifer finished her shift but lingered, claiming she wanted to help with closing duties, though it was clear she was staying for Sarah's sake. Marcus remained in the kitchen, visible through the service window, his massive presence a comfort. Around 9 o'clock, Maria and the boys prepared to leave. Maria stopped by Sarah's booth and pressed something into her hand, a folded piece of paper. Sarah opened it to find a phone number and a note written in Maria's careful script. It said that if Sarah ever needed anything, day or night, she should call. Below that, Maria had written that sometimes the people who save us need saving too, and that Sarah had given them hope when they had none. It was only fair to return the favor. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, and she hugged Maria tightly, thanking her for her kindness. After they left, Sarah sat alone in the booth, the diner now quiet except for the low murmur of the television behind a counter, and the clatter of dishes as Jennifer cleaned up. She thought about the strange turns her life had, how a simple act of feeding 2 hungry children had somehow led to this moment, to her finally ready to face the man she'd been running from. There was a symmetry to it that felt almost poetic, as if the universe had been guiding her toward this confrontation all along. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emily, asking if she was safe. Sarah replied that she was at the diner and had help now. Emily responded with a string of heart emojis and a promise to drive down the next day to be with her. Sarah felt overwhelming gratitude for her sister, for Tony and Marcus and Jennifer, for Margaret and Maria, and even for Danny and Mikey. She'd thought she was alone, had isolated herself so thoroughly that she'd forgotten what it meant to have people in her corner. But she wasn't alone. She had a community, a chosen family, and together they were stronger than anything Alexander could throw at her. The night deepened, and the diner closed its doors to customers. Tony locked up while Sarah remained in her booth, too wired to sleep despite her exhaustion. He made fresh coffee and brought her a slice of pie, then sat down across from her and told her about his own past. He'd been in trouble once, decades ago, had made mistakes that could have destroyed his life. But someone had given him a second chance, had believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. That someone had been his late wife, and her kindness had inspired him to pay it forward, to help others who needed that same chance at redemption. Sarah listened, understanding that Tony was sharing this to let her know she wasn't being judged, that everyone had a past, and what mattered was what you did with your present. She thanked him for everything, for the job, for the sanctuary, for standing with her now when she needed it most. Tony waved off her gratitude, saying she'd earned her place here through hard work and decency, and that was all that mattered. They sat together in companionable silence, drinking coffee and watching the empty street through the window, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. Morning arrived with reluctant gray light, the sun hidden behind thick clouds that promised more snow. Sarah had dozed fitfully in the booth, her sleep haunted by fragmented dreams of pursuit and capture. She woke to find Marcus already in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filling the air. Tony had apparently gone home sometime during the night but returned before dawn, looking tired but determined. He handed her a fresh cup of coffee and told her that Margaret had called. The wheels were in motion. Federal investigators were reviewing preliminary information, and if everything checked out, they would want to meet with Sarah within 48 hours. Sarah absorbed this news with a mixture of relief and terror. 48 hours. In 2 days, she could be free of Alexander forever, could watch his empire crumble under the weight of his own corruption. But 2 days was also an eternity when you were being hunted by a man with unlimited resources and a complete absence of conscience. She asked Tony about the plainclothes officers Margaret had promised, and he nodded toward the window. Across the street, parked in front of a closed laundromat, was an unmarked sedan with 2 people inside trying very hard to look casual. Sarah felt marginally safer knowing they were there. The morning shift began, and Sarah insisted on working despite Tony's protests. She needed the normalcy, needed the familiar rhythm of taking orders and serving food to ground her in reality. She changed into a spare uniform that Jennifer had brought from her locker and stepped onto the floor just as the first customers began arriving. The regulars greeted her with their usual friendly efficiency, and Sarah fell into the comfortable pattern of her job, grateful for the distraction it provided from the anxiety churning in her gut. Around 8:30, a young woman entered the diner carrying a messenger bag and looking around with the practiced eye of someone searching for a specific person. She approached the counter and asked for Sarah by name, and Sarah's first instinct was suspicion, but the woman quickly identified herself as Rachel Morrison, an investigative journalist who'd received a tip about Alexander Crane from an anonymous source. Sarah glanced at Tony, who shrugged, equally puzzled. They hadn't contacted any journalists, which meant someone else had, and Sarah had a sinking feeling she knew who. Rachel explained that she'd been investigating Crane Industries for months, following whispers of corruption and criminality that no one would speak about on the record. Yesterday, she'd received an encrypted email with specific allegations and a suggestion that she speak to someone named Sarah Chun, who worked at Miller's Diner. The email had included just enough verifiable information to convince Rachel it was worth pursuing. Sarah's mind raced. Who had sent that email? Margaret wouldn't have moved that quickly, and she wouldn't have done it without Sarah's permission. Emily didn't have that kind of information. That left only one possibility that made any sense, and it was the one that terrified her most. Alexander had sent it. He was forcing her hand, trying to flush her into the open by making her story public before she was ready. If she spoke to Rachel, she would be committing to going public with everything, would be burning her bridges with Alexander in a way that couldn't be undone. But if she refused to talk, Rachel would investigate it, and the story would come out without Sarah's input, potentially painted in whatever way benefited Alexander's narrative. It was a brilliant tactical move, giving Sarah the illusion of choice while actually boxing her into a corner. Sarah asked Rachel to give her an hour, said she needed to make some calls before deciding whether to talk. Rachel agreed, settling into a booth with her laptop and a coffee, clearly prepared to wait as long as necessary. Sarah stepped into Tony's office and called Margaret, explaining the situation. Margaret cursed creatively and said this was almost certainly Alexander's doing, a way to control the narrative and put pressure on Sarah. But she also admitted that Rachel Morrison was known in law enforcement circles as a serious journalist, someone who did her homework and didn't publish without solid evidence. If Sarah was going to talk to anyone, Rachel wasn't a bad choice. Margaret suggested that Sarah give Rachel the story, but withhold the most damaging evidence until the federal investigation was formalized. That way the public would know Sarah's allegations, but the proof would remain protected and available for prosecutors. Sarah agreed this made sense, though the thought of seeing her life story splashed across newspapers and websites made her feel physically ill. She called Emily next, who answered on the first ring and immediately offered to drive over. Sarah told her sister what was happening, and Emily's response was fierce and protective. She said she'd be there in 3 hours, that Sarah shouldn't do anything until she arrived, that they would face this together. Strengthened by her sister's support, Sarah returned to the main dining area and approached Rachel's booth. She slid into the seat across from the journalist and said she would tell her story, but with condition. Everything had to be verified independently before publication, no quotes attributed to Sarah without her explicit approval, and certain evidence had to be held back for law enforcement. Rachel agreed to these terms without hesitation, pulling out a digital recorder and a notebook. She asked if Sarah was ready to begin, and Sarah took a deep breath, touching the St. Christopher medal in her pocket for luck, and said yes. For the next 2 hours, Sarah recounted her entire history with Alexander Crane. She described their courtship and marriage, the gradual realization of who he really was, the discovery of his crimes. She detailed her escape and the years of hiding, and finally Alexander's reappearance and the escalating threats. Rachel listened intently, asking sharp, specific questions that revealed her deep knowledge of Crane Industries and its business practices. She'd clearly been investigating for a while, and Sarah's testimony was filling in gaps and confirming suspicions the journalist had already formed. They were deep in conversation when the diner's door opened and Alexander walked in. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, and every customer turned to look at the impeccably dressed man who radiated barely controlled fury. Sarah's heart stopped, then started again at double speed. He wasn't supposed to be here, not in broad daylight with witnesses everywhere. But there he was, crossing the diner with deliberate steps, his eyes locked on Sarah with an intensity that promised violence. Tony moved from behind the counter, positioning himself between Alexander and Sarah's booth, but Alexander ignored him completely. He stopped at the table, looking down at Sarah and Rachel with an expression of cold contempt. He told Sarah she'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd given her a chance to do this quietly and she'd chosen the nuclear option. Rachel identified herself as a journalist and started to ask Alexander for comment, but he cut her off with a dismissive gesture. He said he had nothing to say to the press, that any story she published would be met with a defamation lawsuit that would destroy her career. Then he turned his attention back to Sarah, and the mask of civility slipped completely. He told her she had no idea what she'd just done, that the files she thought would protect her were worthless because he'd spent the past 3 years preparing for this possibility. He'd created an alternative narrative, complete with falsified evidence showing that Sarah had been an active participant in his business dealing, that she'd helped him launder money, and had personally benefited from illegal activity. If she tried to expose him, he would expose her right back, and her testimony would be worthless coming from a co-conspirator trying to save herself. The threat was delivered with absolute confidence, and Sarah felt her resolve waver. Could he really have manufactured that much false evidence? Could he actually make it look like she'd been complicit in crimes she'd known nothing about until she'd found those files? Alexander saw her doubt and smiled, a predatory expression that made her skin crawl. He said the offer still stood. Come back to him, play the role of repentant wife, and all of this would go away. The alternative was mutual destruction, and he was betting she didn't have the stomach for it. Sarah looked at this man who'd once convinced her he loved her, who'd promised her a life of comfort and security, and saw him clearly for the first time. He was a bully and a coward, someone who'd built his empire on the backs of people he'd threatened and manipulated. He'd counted on her fear to keep her silent, on her desire for self-preservation to override her sense of justice. But he'd miscalculated. He'd found her at the wrong moment, after she'd already remembered what it meant to stand up for something bigger than herself, after she'd been reminded by 2 brave boys and their grandmother that courage wasn't the absence of fear but action in spite of it. She stood up, her legs steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She told Alexander he could threaten her all he wanted, could manufacture whatever evidence he pleased, but she wasn't backing down. She would tell her story, would hand over her files to federal investigators, and would testify in court if necessary. If he wanted to drag her down with him, then so be it, but she would make sure he went down. And the public would know what kind of man Alexander Crane really was, and his carefully constructed reputation would be destroyed beyond repair. Alexander's face darkened with rage, and for a moment Sarah thought he might actually strike her. But then Marcus was there, his massive bulk suddenly filling the space next to Tony, and the two men formed a wall between Alexander and Sarah. Marcus didn't say anything, just stood there with his arms crossed, but his presence was a clear message. Alexander looked at them, then at the other customers who were watching with varying degrees of alarm and interest, then at Rachel, who was recording everything on her phone. He'd lost, and he knew it. This was too public, too witness for him to do anything without consequences. He stepped back, straightening his coat with jerky movements, his composure cracking. He told Sarah this wasn't over, that she would regret this decision for the rest of her life. Then he turned and walked out of the diner, the bell chiming his departure with incongruous cheerfulness. The moment he was gone, Sarah's legs gave out and she sat down hard, her hands shaking. Rachel was immediately at her side, asking if she was okay, if she needed anything. Tony was on the phone with Margaret, relaying what had just happened. And through the window, Sarah could see the plainclothes officers jumping out of their sedan and running after Alexander. The next 72 hours were a whirlwind of activity that left Sarah feeling like she was watching her life from outside her own body. Margaret arrived within the hour with 2 FBI agents, and Sarah spent the afternoon in Tony's office giving a formal statement. Rachel's story went live that evening on a major news website, carefully worded to avoid litigation, but damning in its implication. The headline read, "Waitress accuses billionaire CEO Alexander Crane of criminal enterprise, flees marriage in fear for her life." Within hours, it had gone viral. Emily arrived as promised, bursting through the diner's door with fierce protective energy and immediately pulling Sarah into a crushing embrace. She'd brought a lawyer friend from Portland, a woman specializing in victims' rights who volunteered to represent Sarah pro bono. Together, they strategized about how to protect Sarah from the legal onslaught they knew was coming. Alexander's attorneys sent cease and desist letters within 24 hours, threatening lawsuits for defamation and demanding retraction of all statements. Sarah's lawyer responded with a letter of her own, stating that Sarah stood by every word and welcomed the opportunity to present her evidence in court. The media descended on Miller's diner like locusts, camera crews and reporters crowding the sidewalk trying to get interviews with Sarah or anyone who knew her. Tony handled them with gruff efficiency, serving customers and refusing to engage with the press beyond a terse no comment. But inside the diner, something remarkable was happening. The regular customers, the construction workers and nurses and early risers who'd been served by Sarah for 3 years, formed a protective circle around her. They ran interference with reporters, shared their own stories of Sarah's kindness and work ethic, and made it clear that she was one of their own. Maria and the boys came every day, bringing food and encouragement. Danny had made Sarah a card decorated with careful drawings of the diner, and Mikey had written in his careful child's handwriting that she was the bravest person he knew. Other customers Sarah had helped over the years emerged from the woodwork with their own stories. A single mother whose tab Sarah had quietly paid when she was short on cash. An elderly man whose medication Sarah had picked up during her break when he couldn't get to the pharmacy. A teenager Sarah had talked down from a bad decision and connected with a counselor. The cumulative picture they painted was of a woman who gave more than she took, who saw people's humanity when others looked away. On the 3rd day, the FBI executed search warrants on Crane Industries headquarters and Alexander's personal residences. The news showed footage of agents carrying boxes of documents out of his downtown office building, and Sarah watched with grim satisfaction. Margaret called to tell her that the preliminary evidence Sarah had provided had been enough to convince a judge that a full investigation was warranted. They were going through everything now, and early indications suggested Sarah's allegations would be substantiated. Alexander was lawyering up, but for the first time in his life, his money and power weren't enough to make his problems disappear. The turning point came on the 4th day. Sarah was working the morning shift, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy despite the reporters still camped outside, when a black SUV pulled up to the diner. Alexander emerged, flanked by his lawyers and a camera crew of his own. He'd clearly decided that if this battle was going to be fought in public, he would control his own narrative. He strode into the diner with the cameras rolling and every customer turned to watch. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, unsure what was happening, but certain it couldn't be good. Alexander positioned himself in the center of the dining area, the cameras focused on him, and began speaking in the authoritative tone he used for press conferences. He announced that he was here to set the record straight, that the allegations against him were fabrications created by a troubled woman who'd abandoned her marriage and was now trying to extort money from him. He painted a picture of Sarah as mentally unstable, as someone who'd married him for his wealth and then turned vindictive when he'd refused to fund her increasingly erratic lifestyle. It was a masterful performance, delivered with just the right blend of sorrow and strength. Then he played his trump card. He looked directly at the cameras and said the words that were clearly meant to be his winning move. "She's my wife," he declared, his voice ringing with false emotion. "Whatever problems we've had, whatever lies she's told, that doesn't change the fact that I love her and I want to help her get the treatment she needs. I'm prepared to forgive everything if she'll just come home and let me take care of her. It was a brilliant strategy, positioning himself as the wronged but magnanimous husband, Sarah as the unwell wife in need of saving. In one statement, he'd attempted to discredit her testimony and paint himself as a victim. But Alexander had made a critical miscalculation. He'd assumed the performance would happen in a vacuum, with only his cameras and compliant witnesses. He'd forgotten that Miller's diner was Sarah's territory, filled with people who knew her, who'd watched her work and struggle and survive for 3 years. Before Sarah could respond, Tony stepped forward, placing himself between Alexander and the camera. His weathered face was set in lines of absolute contempt, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize bullshit when he heard it. Tony told the cameras and anyone watching that he'd known Sarah Chun for 3 years, had employed her and observed her character daily. She was one of the most honest, hard-working people he'd ever met. Someone who gave her last dollar to help a stranger and never asked for anything in return. He said he'd also had the misfortune of meeting Alexander Crane multiple times over the past, and everything he'd seen confirmed that the man was a bully and a liar who thought his money could buy him anything, including control over a woman who'd been brave enough to leave him. Marcus emerged from the kitchen, adding his voice to Tony's. He recounted how Sarah had fed 2 hungry children without hesitation, how she'd called for help instead of calling the authorities, how she'd put their well-being above rules and profit. Then Maria stood up from her booth, Danny and Mikey flanking her, and she told the cameras that Sarah had saved her grandsons' lives with her kindness. That a woman who would do that for strangers was not someone capable of the deceptions Alexander was describing. One by one, other customers stood and shared their own stories, creating a chorus of testimony that drowned out Alexander's carefully crafted narrative. Rachel Morrison was there too, and she stepped forward with her own camera crew, asking Alexander pointed questions about the FBI investigation, about the documents being seized from his offices, about specific allegations of bribery and corruption. Alexander tried to maintain his composure, but it was cracking under the weight of collective opposition. This wasn't how the scene was supposed to play out. He was supposed to dominate, to control, to win through force of personality and resources. But he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered by ordinary people who'd simply decided to stand up for someone they cared about. Sarah found her voice then, stepping out from behind the counter to face Alexander directly. She told him in the cameras that she wasn't his wife, not in any meaningful sense. Their marriage had been a legal fiction she'd been trapped in, and she'd freed herself the day she walked away. She said she'd spent 3 years building a new life based on honesty and hard work, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was rather than what she could do for them. She admitted she was terrified of what the investigation might mean for her own future, but she was done being silent and done being afraid. She pulled out the St. Christopher medal Maria had given her and held it up, explaining that it had been a gift from someone she'd helped, a reminder that protection and grace came not from wealth or power but from human connection and decency. She said that Alexander could threaten her with lawsuits and false evidence, could try to destroy her reputation and her life, but he couldn't take away the community she'd found or the person she'd become. She would rather lose everything standing up for the truth and gain the world by living a lie. The confrontation ended not with a dramatic flourish, but with Alexander's quiet retreat. Faced with a room full of people willing to testify on Sarah's behalf, with cameras capturing everything, with his carefully planned narrative falling apart, he simply left. His lawyers followed, already on their phones, no doubt strategizing damage control. The journalists surged after him, shouting questions, but Sarah remained in the diner, surrounded by the people who'd stood with her. The weight of 3 years of fear and hiding seemed to lift from her shoulders, and for the first time since Alexander had walked back into her life, she felt like she could breathe. The legal battle took months. The FBI investigation expanded as more victims came forward, emboldened by Sarah's courage. Alexander's empire began to crumble as business partners distanced themselves and investors pulled their money. He was eventually indicted on multiple counts of fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. Sarah had to testify before a grand jury, had to relive every moment of her discovery and escape, but she did it with Emily by her side, and the knowledge that her community was waiting for her back at the diner. The divorce was finalized 6 months after that confrontation in Miller's diner. Sarah kept her chosen name, Sarah Chun, legally changing it so that Sarah Crane could be relegated to history. She continued working at the diner, though Tony eventually made her a manager and partner, acknowledging that she'd brought something special to the place beyond just good service. Danny and Mikey thrived. Their grandmother's financial struggles eased by the assistance programs Patricia had connected them with, and they visited Sarah regularly, the boys growing taller and more confident with each passing month. A year after everything began, Sarah stood in the diner during the morning lull and looked around at the cracked vinyl booths and humming fluorescent lights. This place, which had once been just a job, had become her home. The people who filled it, customers and co-workers alike, had become her family. She thought about how one simple act of kindness, feeding 2 hungry boys on a snowy night, had set in motion a chain of events that had both destroyed and saved her. If she hadn't helped Danny and Mikey, if she hadn't been reminded of her own capacity for goodness, would she have found the courage to stand against Alexander? She would never know. And what she did know was that courage wasn't something you possessed. It was something you chose every day, in small moments and large ones. It was feeding children who needed help. It was running from a powerful man who wanted to control you. It was standing your ground when every instinct screamed to flee. And it was building a life based not on wealth or status, but on connection and community, and the simple human act of showing up for each other. Sarah Chun had learned that the hard way, but she'd learned it well, and she would carry that knowledge forward into whatever came next, knowing that she would never face it alone.